He is an author who has covered Canadian and American politics for more than 40 years. Today in conversation with Andrew Cohen. Welcome to the studio and welcome to Pembroke, Andrew.
Pleased to be here.
I'm going to really test you in this interview, and that is we are going to talk about two very different times in American politics, and that is the 60s with John F. Kennedy as the president in the White House, and now Donald Trump. I can't think of a bigger contradiction at this point. And the reason I want to do that is you've written a very interesting book about John F. Kennedy and two speeches in particular that he delivered in the 1960s while he was president, and you've called it 2 Days in June. Tell me about the book.
Well, in 1963, John F. Kennedy is 2.5 years into his very brief administration. In June of '63, he's been president since January of 1961. And it's the Cold War, it's the beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement, and John F. Kennedy is finding his way through. 1961 is a very tough year for him. He has a setback at the Bay of Pigs when the American-backed Cuban force falters on the beach. He has a difficult meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna in June. He watches the Berlin Wall go up in August. And at the end of 1961, when somebody says to him, "Mr. President, I'd like to write a history of your time in office, first year in office," he said, "Why would you want to write a history of disasters?" That was very Kennedy-esque, self-deprecating. 1962, things are better. He forces the integration of the University of Mississippi in September of that year, and famously in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October, he faces down Nikita Khrushchev in what is today remains the great confrontation of the Cold War. By 1963, he's trying to get ahead of events. He says, we came very close, the Soviet Union and the United States, to blowing ourselves up. It was a searing experience for both Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, who came to appreciate each other. At the same time, the forces of the Civil Rights Movement are in train. When John F. Kennedy arrived in 1961, the Freedom Riders, those kids who got on buses to integrate bus stations and interstate bus travel, were beginning to show up in places. And so the Civil Rights Movement was really gaining momentum. Well, by 1963, America's aflame. Birmingham, Alabama, and Cambridge, Maryland, and Chicago and Los Angeles, there is a growing movement. So in 1963, by June, as it happens, the president will give two seminal speeches in which he will pivot on the two biggest issues of his presidency, of the 1960s, indeed of his generation: nuclear arms and civil rights. And both have their roots in events of several months before. The speech on civil rights has its roots in the integration of the University of Mississippi, and on nuclear arms, it will have its roots in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what I do is look at two speeches, one given on June the 10th, 1963, the other given on June the 11th, 1963, given under entirely different circumstances, one carefully prepared for several weeks, the other virtually spontaneous, one in reaction to the sense that we need a rapprochement with the Soviet Union, so that's the nuclear arms treaty, speech on nuclear arms. The other in reaction to the integration of the University of Alabama, which will have taken place that very day on June the 11th. So what I do is I build a narrative around 2 days in the life of this extraordinary president who loved words, who felt the power of speeches. In those days, Jamie, to give a speech was something important. Both of these speeches, incidentally, were telecast live, although they were given under very different circumstances. The first speech was given at American University in Washington, D.C. The president he gives the commencement address. And it's called now the Peace Speech because in that speech on June the 10th, in the morning of June the 10th, 1963, he attempts to do what no president had done in the Cold War. And this is the height of the Cold War. He attempts to humanize the Russians. He talks about their achievements in literature, in medicine, in science. He talks about their the cost they paid in the Second World War when they were America's allies, when 20 or 25 million Russians were killed. He praises them, and this kind of language, approaching a rapprochement, had not been heard, and Khrushchev would say this, had not been heard since Franklin Roosevelt spoke of the Russians, who was, of course, was allied with Joe Stalin and Winston Churchill, as the big three as they were called. And from that speech, to show you it's not just words, and often speeches are just words, from that speech, which is an appeal to the Russians to, in a sense, dial back nuclear arms, comes the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. And this is the first of the Cold War treaties. So in that speech, after humanizing the Russians, President Kennedy says, now let's talk. There had been back conversations about this, and within 6 weeks, there was that Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that banned the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. It was okay to do it on the oceans, but not in the atmosphere. That is considered John F. Kennedy's greatest achievement in foreign policy, in his abbreviated presidency. The next speech was on civil rights. It too was seminal, done entirely differently. In reaction to facing down, George Wallace had tried to block the entry of
the governor of Alabama.
Governor of Alabama, excuse me, at Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The University of Alabama is there. 2 black students, James Hood and Vivian Malone, had tried to be admitted. Wallace says no, and he famously stands in what's called the schoolhouse door. And he gives a speech, and he worries, and he rants about the power of the federal government, and he prevents their physical admission. They're not at the door, they're somewhere else. It's carefully choreographed by the Kennedys. The Kennedys send in the National Guard and integrate that university. It's the last of the big Southern universities to be integrated. That night, that very night, so there's a 2-hour time difference, Wallace walks away from the door about 3 o'clock. It's 5 o'clock in Washington, and Kennedy turns to his speechwriter, the extraordinary Ted Sorensen, whose widow I've spent a considerable amount of time with, and says, Ted, it's about time we gave that speech on civil rights tonight. And Ted Sorensen says, what speech? There is no speech. Well, by the way, Ted, I booked both networks for 8 o'clock this evening. And there begins the scramble, which I describe in intimate detail of how Ted Sorensen has to craft, and will craft, imperishable words for JFK, in which he will do 2 things. He will redefine what civil rights means to America in 1963. He will call it not a legal question, but a moral question. The legal question is, we can't keep forcing you to integrate, I mean, we can, but that's not what we should be doing. As he's appealed the day before to Americans to humanize the Russians, he wants white America to see black Americans differently, Negroes as they're then called. And he talks about, in a short speech of 12 or 14 minutes, what it's like to be a black American in the United States in June of 1963. You'll make much less money, you won't live as long, you won't get out of high school. And he does this in a very powerful way. But he does something else that night. He will introduce what will be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was of 1963. He does not live to see it. Jamie, you'll know, that is one of the 2 or 3 seminal pieces of legislation, landmark law in American history. So 2 speeches in 2 days, one which will produce the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the other which over the next year will produce the Civil Rights Act, and around it I write a narrative of the Kennedy presidency. I follow him hour by hour. It's the tick-tock of the American presidency. I have his schedule, and I watch him at the White House and what he does, whether he's at the swimming pool, where he swims twice a day, or at a dinner party in Georgetown. I take my readers there. I pull back the curtain. And so what I really have is not just the pillars of the book, which are the 2 speeches and how they're done and how carefully they're crafted or how quickly they're crafted, but also what it's like to be Commander-in-Chief and President of the United States in the spring of 1963, when the world is changing and America is somersaulting into the 1960s. So I try and take my reader there. Well, long-winded answer.
And regrettably, JFK 6 months later is assassinated in Dallas. We've both been to Dealey Plaza, and that is an emotional place to go for anyone who is interested in the Kennedy presidency. I commend you for finding an opportunity to write something different There has been so much written about the Kennedy presidency, whether it be the assassination, the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, all of those different things. How did you get to that point?